Thank you, David. And Secretary Clinton, it's so good to be back with you. I know that you were a great admirer of Justice Ginsburg. So let's talk about her here at the outset. She had such an outsized impact on equality and justice in this country. I dare say that so much that we take for granted today, we don't realize that she was responsible for so many of those breakthroughs when it came to credit and pay and ending discrimination in education and in so many areas. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about her legacy and how you remember her and perhaps how she inspired you.
Well, of course I can. And I'm delighted. I think you could not be talking about a better person for a conference on equality and inclusivity. And as you know, Melanne, because you were also very active in a lot of the movement around women's equality and rights, Ruth was a trailblazer. She set out the legal thinking that led to a lot of the breakthrough decisions, which really did change our world. It's hard, I think, for younger people to even imagine, but when I was a young woman, I was not eligible for credit or a credit card or a mortgage. It didn't matter how much money I made. I was absolutely prohibited because I was a woman. So these kinds of changes that everybody now just assumes have been around forever really can be attributed to the decades-long effort that Ruth began to knock down the barriers for women's equality, but more than that, for equality and inclusivity across the board. And of course, as you know, she served with great distinction as a law professor and a litigator, and then Jimmy Carter put her on the Court of Appeals.
And it was interesting the way she began to make her case when she was still at the ACLU arguing before the Supreme Court in several instances. And she took on cases involving gender discrimination against men to demonstrate that men too were discriminated against. And this was something we all had to understand, right?
Absolutely. And that was one of the, many examples of her legal acumen and genius, because she knew that under the 14th Amendment, she had a struggle to persuade courts that sex should be given the same level of scrutiny when the government was either passing out or withholding rights and favors as race. And it was quite an argument for her to make. And one of the ways that she did it that was masterfully explained in both the biography of her and the biodoc that was a drama, she took men on as clients, and she made the case looking at all white men judges that, they could relate to, and that began to slowly but steadily tear down the barriers that she was aiming at.
So President Clinton nominated her, only the second woman to ever ascend to the Supreme Court. And I wonder in that period when he was trying to determine who he would indeed nominate, if you perhaps mentioned this woman, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, to him.
Well, you know that I did, Melanne, because you were right there conspiring with me. The vacancy opened up, and there were so many people vying for it, and lots of lists coming into the White House of highly qualified people who were being put forth for the president to consider. I felt strongly that he needed to look at women, and at the top of my list was Ruth Bader Ginsburg, because I knew of her work. I admired that work. I knew of her record on the Court of Appeals, where she had continued to make and change the way we think about equality. and where she was a really good colleague, including with then Judge Scalia, who had been elevated to the Supreme Court. So I thought she was not only a strong candidate based on her own abilities and record, but that she could be someone to bring the court to a point of view. I did recommend that the president look at her, and I just got an email earlier today from one of the men who was in the department that processed judges, and he said, "Well, you were right," and I made the case to Bill that at least he should sit down with her and get to know her, and then make his own decision. So on a Sunday, she was kind of smuggled into the White House, told to be totally, dressed down, not looking like an elevated judge in any way, taken up to the residence of the White House, where she joined Bill, who I can't remember was watching football or basketball or one of the sports of the time, and they began to talk. And it was like a master class in legal analysis, and particularly around the Constitution, because Bill had taught constitutional law years before. And when he finished the meeting with her, he said, "Boy, I know what you mean." He was totally sold that she could fill the kind of role that he envisioned for his first appointment to the court.
So we mourn her passing, but we celebrate what she had truly achieved, that obviously will continue to make such an impact in years to come. Her most fervent wish, we now know, made from her deathbed and told to her granddaughter, was that she not be replaced until after a new president was elected. She didn't want the court to be dragged through a terrible political battle. She cared so much about the institution of the court and what it represents in our democracy. But that obviously now we know is not going to happen. The president appears to have all of the votes he needs for whoever he will nominate. And I gather we will hear that before much longer. Where does this all go now? Is it up to the American people and the election? How does this play out?
Well, I think you're absolutely right, Melanne, that Justice Ginsburg had such reverence for the court and the law and the Constitution that when she dictated that statement to her granddaughter, she was not speaking personally or certainly not as any kind of partisan. She was offering her measured opinion that it would be in the interests of our country and most certainly in the interests of the court so close to an election to allow the election to go forward. And then whoever was elected would be able to choose the next justice. I really respect that. I understand that it's not going to be honored. And now we are left with what will be a very unfortunate display of partisan power to push through whoever the president nominates. And what I hope the American people will pay attention to is not the partisanship and the conflict in the Senate and all, but what's at stake? What's at stake for them? Because one thing about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she never lost sight of the impact that her decisions had on the people she represented as a lawyer or the people who were involved in the cases she adjudicated as a judge. And I think it's absolutely clear that what's really at stake, first and foremost in this choice, is health care. The court is scheduled to hear yet another challenge to the Affordable Care Act right after the election. So presumably, whoever is appointed can participate in some way in that decision. And it really speaks to the fervent desire of the Republicans under Trump and McConnell to get rid of the Affordable Care Act in the middle of a pandemic that has cost us more than 200,000 lives. And what that will mean is that for about 130 million Americans with pre-existing conditions, their insurance costs will go up, assuming they can even get insurance. For more than 20 million, they will lose their policies if the court fulfills the hopes of the Republican majority in the Senate and the White House to repeal and eliminate the Affordable Care Act. But it will also affect many other people, young people on their parents' plans, and so much else. And I think that we can get caught up in the contest over who replaces her, but I think Justice Ginsburg would say, keep your eye on what this means. We're heading into an election. It is hard fought. It may result in the change in the White House. And having this seat filled right now, as opposed to waiting until we know who the president is, could very well mean the end of the Affordable Care Act and the loss of health care for millions of Americans who have suffered from COVID-19 and therefore may now have new pre-existing conditions that will render them less affordable for health care.
You know, it's just stunning to contemplate that stake alone. But here we are at the Bloomberg Equality Summit, and issues of women's equality, LGBTQ, racial justice at a time when that is such a prominent issue for our country to address. What happens in these other areas? They too are at stake.
Well, I believe that there has been a longstanding, well-financed effort to do exactly what we're seeing today, and that is to try to fill the courts with people of a certain ideology, a certain point of view, that were selected and groomed by big institutions to be put forward by Republican presidents. And there is no doubt in my mind that we will see considerable turning back of a lot of what we have taken for granted, because it's not only the rights that you just enumerated, it's also corporate power, money in elections, whether or not our government will continue to try to guarantee clean air, clean water, let alone dealing with climate change. Because many of the people who have already been elevated to the federal bench under Trump are people who come with far fewer qualifications than other nominees in the past by both Democratic and Republican presidents. But many come with a preconceived notion that is really outcome driven to limit the power of government, to look after the common good, to try to unite us instead of divide us for the benefit of small groups with certain agendas. So I think we're in for a period of judicial activism that will disregard precedent and undo, or at least limit, the progress that certainly I believe we've been making in trying to come to grips with the complexity of a modern world and all of the demands that it places upon our democracy.
You know, in the context of what's going to be happening to the Supreme Court, there have been those who have talked about, ruminated about, speculated about, lobbied for a need to expand the court. Do you see that as a practical option?
I think that's a step too far right now. I think that the Democrats, the press, the public really need to make it absolutely clear what's at stake with this appointment. Because yes, maybe they have the votes, but they should have to justify and defend what they are doing at this point when they're not providing additional assistance to the unemployed in our country, when they're not helping state and local governments deal with the tremendous fallout of the COVID crisis. And I think that they should have to be held accountable for that before we go and speculate about what might else be considered. Let's focus on the here and now and the consequences of this decision to the vast majority of Americans?
I'd like to ask you about another issue that is fundamentally about equality, and that is the fact that 25 years ago this month, you gave a speech in Beijing at the UN Fourth World Conference on Women, and those words still echo around the world. Human rights are women's rights, and women's rights are human rights. And I wonder, these 25 years later, how you see that progress, how far we've come in this country and certainly around the world, and what more we need to do to accelerate the rate at which we're closing the gap, so to speak.
Well, in the last 25 years, we have seen progress. I would be the first to make that clear. We have seen progress in the number of girls going to school, finishing education, going beyond primary school to secondary school, going on to college. We've seen progress in healthcare, better access to healthcare. We've seen a dropping in maternal mortality and infant mortality that was often disproportionately suffered by female infants. So we've seen progress on those two areas, but we've pretty much stalled out when it comes to the economy and business in terms of women's advancement and women's opportunities. When it comes to politics and government, trying to increase the number of women in government, the women in democracies running for and being elected to positions, and in the area of peace and security. So there is still a lot of work to be done. And as I said in a recent article that I wrote for The Atlantic commemorating the 25th anniversary of that speech, I framed it 25 years ago as enumerating and claiming the rights that women should have in the interests of full equality and participation. But rights are meaningless if you don't have the power to actually obtain those rights. And I think that we've seen how the power to actually move us forward on an equality agenda for women has been stalled in many places, particularly in conflict areas where women are the primary victims of war, certainly in the increasing autocracy and authoritarianism in many countries where often women are the first to suffer when there are crackdowns from authoritarian leaders. And I want to underscore, which will certainly be an issue in the Supreme Court choice and is an issue globally, that women's ability to control their own reproductive health is critical to the independence, the autonomy, and the equality of women around the world. So this is a complicated issue, and I think anyone who cares about women's equality in our country or elsewhere needs to look carefully about what more needs to be done to ensure that we make progress across the board.
There's certainly a great deal to do to move to the end of that journey. We're far from reaching the equality marker. You had mentioned the pandemic in the context of the Affordable Care Act. And one of the things that COVID has done is truly expose the inequalities in this country and certainly around the world. And, Bill and Melinda Gates, whom you know so well, put out an annual goalkeepers report that looks at what progress we've made on addressing poverty. And their 2020 report is quite unsettling. And its headline is 25 years of progress wiped out in 25 weeks. There is so much concern, rightful concern, that the pandemic's impacts are going to set us back in very significant ways. I want to end with this because you have done so much in the areas of development in education, in women in the economy, and so many ways that the progress that you mentioned that's occurred in these 25 years has happened. How do you see us beginning to close this once this is behind us? How do we build back, let alone build back better?
Well, there's a lot of unsettling and quite concerning news coming forth. In our own country, the disproportionate impact on women's employment, the so-called essential workers and healthcare line workers has been falling on women, and women losing their jobs, particularly when they were relatively low wage jobs in retail and elsewhere in the economy, has posed an extraordinary impact on women, particularly women who are either the sole support or contributing support for children. We also know that because of the difficulty of getting daycare up and going, getting school started again, many women are dropping out of the workforce. They are unable to find their way forward to care for their children plus return to work because there is no real support for that. So even in an advanced economy like the United States and European countries that certainly suffered both the double whammy of the health costs and the economic losses, we're going to have to pay particular attention to the disproportionate burden borne by women and girls. In the rest of the world, we're seeing a lot of danger signals coming our way. Domestic violence, insofar as we're able to calculate it, seems to have gone up everywhere, but in particular in more poverty ridden locations where the suffering is so acute. We've seen, we believe, based again on the evidence we have that the Gates Foundation and others have collected, an increase in taking children out of school so that they can beg and scrounge to try to help support the family when the global economy has been so decimated. We're seeing more child brides. We were working really hard to try to diminish the practice of giving your young daughters away as brides. We've seen reports of increases in human trafficking and labor trafficking. People are desperate. And as the individual governments think about the path forward, I hope that international institutions will play a role in trying to set forth guidelines and frameworks for building back, for trying to be sure we help the most vulnerable among us try to recover. And the other point that I just want to reiterate here is if you don't have a universal healthcare system, such as we do not have in our country, we now know there are long-term effects of COVID. So even though we have a just tragic number of 200,000 lives lost, we have many hundreds of thousands of people who have experienced the virus, and we're seeing more and more evidence that they are having chronic effects, and they might not be eligible for health care, or their ability to do the same work they did before could be impacted by more limited mobility or heart problems or whatever might occur. Multiply that times many over in the developing world, and you can see how someone who was the primary caretaker, someone who was the small farmer might no longer be able to do quite as much. So we do have a huge amount of work ahead of us, and the United States should be a leader in trying to help the not only American public and economy recover, but the world economy. That's good for us if we get more people back into gainful employment and get economic activity going again.
Well, we have a tall agenda ahead of all of us in terms of so many important issues, and certainly equality among them. So we're out of time, but thank you so much for being with us at the Bloomberg Equality Summit. Thank you, Secretary Clinton.
Thank you, Melanne.